Thank you, everyone, for joining part 3 of our series. We have had 2 previous installations of this series on emerging trends, the first of which back in January, where we really kind of dove into and discussed how performance management is changing and what some examples through case studies were around how companies had shifted their performance management strategies and approaches and the compensation implications associated with that. In part 2, we really talked about learning strategies and how to implement those for continued growth and development of your employees. And today we're going to speak about really the shift towards development. So in those continual conversations managers are having with their employees, in those more frequent check-ins we've discussed, really the shift is, again, towards thinking about a forward-looking approach rather than a rear-view mirror approach in terms of what did you do over the last 6 months? What did you do over the last year? Instead, managers are really shifting those conversations with employees around how do we develop you? How do we continue your growth and success within our organization? What is it that you want to do, and how can we as managers in an organization help you to get there? So today we're going to talk specifically around that and go into 4 case studies that will really kind of give good examples, I think, of how companies have done that. So in general, the trend that we're seeing, and just going to continue on with the previous 2 iterations of this series, we're seeing the trend here for moving away from performance management and conversations with employees and managers from an annual event where it's really compliance-centric, and managers are sitting down with their employees and really kind of going through a process. It's very process-driven, heavily pushed out by HR, and oftentimes seen by managers as just simply kind of another thing they have to do on their checklist, another task. It's burdensome. It's often administratively cumbersome. And we're seeing this shift to be more ongoing feedback. So you may still retain annual processes within your organization that are associated with a formal feedback review process or formal compensation processes tied into that. But the trend is that there is more ongoing coaching and development between managers and employees. Sometimes that's more frequently than once per year in terms of being twice per year. Maybe sometimes it's quarterly. And I've seen some clients that I'm working with move to even more frequently than quarterly, depending on maybe they have a huge project coming up or lots of milestones that they need to kind of track progress against. To kind of shift in those conversations towards development, maybe reprioritizing goals if they need to over the course of the year as business needs change and develop, and maybe the employee's role changes and develops along with those shifting needs in the business. We're seeing it move, of course, again, from being process-centric to more people-centric. So rather than just being kind of an administratively cumbersome task where managers are forced to kind of go through a checklist of compliance items like we mentioned, but really towards people-centric and understanding that the crux of the conversations that happen between managers and employees, that's where the critical piece of development is. That's where the critical piece of performance management is. And if you have employees and managers addressing performance issues or areas for improvement only once per year when you have those touch points, when you have those formal processes, then you're really waiting too long as a manager to address issues as they arise and course correct should you need to. Also, in terms of development, the previous kind of trend or the standard has been to focus on who your existing leaders are. So you've got tried and true leaders in your organization. You're going to grow, you're going to develop them and make sure that they, maintain their success. But really we're seeing a shift towards not just maintaining our existing leadership, but really focus on who's coming up the pipe. Who do we need to focus on for future developmental needs in our organization? Where do we see when we think about succession planning, where do we see potential gaps? Where do we see people who are high potential and who have expressed interest in leadership opportunities or have expressed interest in new areas of learning or new roles they may fill within your organization? How are we focusing on those people and developing those leaders and developing those skills and getting them ready to kind of come up and succeed people who are already in existing leadership positions? We're also seeing, performance management and development programs shifting away from people who are tenure-based towards really kind of development on demand. So many programs or leadership academies that are current in these organizations or even certifications that you may allow employees to kind of go through via classes or online learning. Oftentimes, those are tenure-based. So you have to be here for X number of years. You have to be in the role for X number of months or years, et cetera, before you can be eligible to go through these kinds of development or leadership or learning programs. And we're really seeing that move away from that tenure-based kind of focus to really kind of being Development on demand. So as employees have more frequent conversations with their managers, as employees check in more frequently with their managers and are engaged and empowered to have conversations with managers where they can talk about their future, where they can say, this is where I see myself going and developing. We're seeing that development on demand be offered as a means for employees to reach their goals. So managers being aware of and being trained to have those conversations, know what's kind of in your library in your organization that your employees can access for development, for learning, and also being able to direct them elsewhere and empower them to do that and find learning opportunities on their own as the need approaches, as the demand surfaces, rather than just waiting for an arbitrary number of years in a role. And we're seeing also the traditional emphasis on appraisal, really kind of thinking about what did you do last year, how did you track to your goals, and really that's the crux of the performance conversation, really seeing it towards the emphasis on development as we've already discussed. So I'll take a quick moment, if you don't mind, and Holly, if you'll help me out here, we'll have our first polling question. So as we discussed in the previous two iterations of this series, we know that people have been shifting their performance management processes. So I wanted to ask you all, how have you done this, or have you done this? So have you done nothing at all so far, or have you eliminated forced distribution? Have you eliminated ratings? Have you replaced annual performance reviews with more frequent check-ins, or replaced goal setting with more near-term goal setting rather than an annual approach? So just want to take a moment and kind of gauge of our audience here and see what they've done. It seems like we've got 45% or so of companies who are saying they've done nothing so far, and probably you're thinking about this because the trend is really picking up in terms of cadence, in terms of being under the magnifying glass, so to speak, to kind of have these developmental conversations and have these more frequent check-ins. So maybe you're exploring kind of what to do, what works best for your culture. Looks like a number of you, 23%, have separated performance discussions from compensation discussions. This is a trend we're going to discuss later in one of the case studies, but I see this happening quite a lot and becoming something as on the checklist or items to think about for a lot of the clients I'm working with. So really think about this. Oftentimes when we have our performance and compensation discussions, they're integrated into one kind of annual focal point, right? So the managers sit down with those employees, they talk about the performance, they give them a rating, they say kind of, where areas for improvement might be, they talk about successes over the last year, and they tie all this into compensation. So what's your merit increase going to be? What's your bonus payout going to be if you're eligible for incentive compensation? And so a lot of people will find, and I think that we've all had the experience with employees and hearing from managers, that the conversation around performance really gets lost in that, right? So people are really thinking about, okay, let's get to the point. What's my payout going to be? What's my increase going to be? So a lot of companies are shifting away from having those two conversations at the same time. Performance, of course, and compensation are intrinsically and inherently related to one another. We're going to reward high performers, of course, but having the conversations at separate times. So having that space or that time frame set aside where you're just talking about the employee's performance, where you're just talking about their development, what their future looks like. And then maybe a month or so later, which is typically the time frame I'm seeing so far, a month or so after performance discussions, you're going to have those compensation discussions. So, checking in with the employees, and that way the focal point of that conversation can be about compensation, whereas the focal point that we want to be about performance and development can really just be centered on that without the distraction of talking about compensation and having that emotional baggage that can kind of come sometimes with those types of conversations. So thanks everyone for participating in that poll. Now, it looked like from our previous polling question, most of our respondents, around 45%, I think, have not done anything yet, and that's typical. So we're seeing in a poll conducted by Brandon Hall Group that 57% of companies that they polled late last year in 2016 have also done nothing, but a lot of people are thinking about it. And the things I really want to raise kind of your attention to are that people are thinking about, we're talking a lot about removing and replacing annual performance reviews and kind of talk about in the more frequent check-ins. Very few companies surveyed are doing this right now. So there's a lot of talk about it, and we've got some great examples of why this is a good thing to do, and lots of pros as to why to do this and why this shift makes sense, but very few companies are actually doing it so far, as reported in this poll. And even fewer, only 11%, are talking about having replacing annual goal setting meetings with more near-term goal-setting meetings. So, I think those two go in tandem with one another. If you're going to have more frequent check-ins in an annual performance process, then you're going to have to maybe shift your goal-setting priorities or shift your goal-setting processes and check in with those goals as they may shift and change to strategically align with your business needs over the course of the year. So those two things that seem like they're getting a lot of attention, that seem like lots of people are talking about them, in reality, very few people are doing these activities so far. And I think that we've heard a lot of people talk about it, and there's a lot of good information around why this is good. But so far, very few people are doing it, and even more people, 57% of this poll, about 45 or 8% of our audience today have done nothing so far. So maybe you're thinking about it, maybe you're gathering information, and maybe these case studies I'll share with you today can help you just have some food for thought and some things to think about. We do know that according to HCM practices, we know that according to Brandon Hall again, that top HCM, human capital management practices for 2017 are going to be learning and development. So 79% of companies say learning and development activities are going to be top of house, front of mind. This is what they're going to be focusing their energies on, because as we see, the workforce is changing. We see people moving around roles more frequently. We see the need of the workforce to have more learning and development opportunities. That's a continued point that people, when they're surveyed on an engagement survey, say, I want more learning opportunities and I want to be empowered to find them. So making the shift and really thinking about what's your organization's learning and development strategy over the next year is really going to be top of house for most companies. And what to do with that. So what are some priorities? You have to engage your partners. So one of the things that we'll hear from many of the case studies we'll go into today, the lessons learned are almost always engage stakeholders, engage business unit leaders, engage not only the HR leadership team in your organization, but the leadership team of all the business units across your organization from the beginning. Get their buy-in and have sit-downs with them to understand kind of what are their needs, what learning and development opportunities make sense for their employee population, because it may not be the same across the entire organization, and you may need to tailor certain approaches for certain business units. But really engaging your partners, having the voice of the customer front of mind, and understanding really what it is that your organization, your culture needs, and foster communication between managers and employees, but also between employees and managers. So as we said, it's important that managers are equipped and trained and understand how to have effective conversations with their employees when they have these more frequent check-ins, and really having them give the tools in their back pocket to kind of guide employees and have meaningful, effective conversations around how to get them where they need to be. But on the flip side of that, we have to make sure that communication is fostered from employees to managers too. So it cannot be just a top-down approach. It has to be top-down, bottom-up. It has to be across the board, people being able to communicate and being empowered to say to your manager, I work in compensation. I'd like to learn benefits. I'd like to have a rotation in employee relations or whatever it looks like. But being able to have employees and managers both the training, the tools, and being equipped to kind of have that dialogue is critical. And demonstrate accountability. So we want to make sure that managers that managers understand that they are accountable for their employees' development, for the retention of the success of their employees. So making sure that that message is heard loud and clear so that managers understand this is critical, and reinforcing development with rewards and recognition. This does not have to be monetary. If someone, reaches a developmental milestone and passes a course or gets a certification or has completed a rotation in a different unit or different function, provide them some type of reward and recognition, whether that be, additional PTO or recognition in a newsletter internally or monetary spot bonuses, whatever it looks like. These are priorities that will help reinforce a development culture. And we know that the trend is to move away from talent management to people management, and it really is critical when you think about the statistics on the screen here that we develop the talent that we have today. So fostering, like I said in the beginning, kind of those emerging leaders and developing those emerging leaders, because 89% of companies agree that it's less expensive to hire from within your organization, so to promote from within and to bring someone else on externally. 86% of companies say that it's faster within the organization, not only to get someone into a new role, but to get them up to speed in that role, to get their time to be effective in that role shortened and truncated. That the best kind of pool and the talent that is the talent that you already have. So making sure that you assess that talent, that you kind of do a skills gap assessment of that talent and kind of think about succession planning in a strategic way and incorporate development activities with those conversations and with that strategic planning so that you can capitalize on the talent that you already have and that you can get people on board into new roles and up to speed in more quick and seamless ways. So first off, I'm going to take secondly, I want to take another poll question, please, from our audience and just kind of get a sense of, what is your focus of your performance management programs right now? So do you think that your performance management programs in your company it's really down to two things. Are you developing an employee's strengths or are you correcting weaknesses? So it seems like most of our attendees in the audience are focused on developing strengths, a little bit less than half on correcting weaknesses of employees. And that's typically kind of what we're going to see in the market as well via other research. So let me just move to the next slide here. Thank you. Great. So what we saw in the previous slide was about 53% of our audience have their targets or their focus of their development programs towards developing strengths. And in a survey by Brandon Hall, again, the same survey that I referenced earlier, 49% of companies are really focusing on developing employee strengths. So we want to make sure that this number continues to rise. So correcting weaknesses, of course, and thinking about opportunities for learning is critical. And of course, we're not saying that, everyone who shows up just gets a pat on the back and so everybody gets a trophy. And we're only going to talk about strengths and we're only going to talk about positive things, but really thinking about the employment development conversations and the managers as coaches, the managers coaching your employees, you're really going to think about what are the best ways that I can empower you? What are the best ways that I can reinforce what you're already doing right? And understanding that maybe not everyone has the same strengths. And so understanding what that employee's strengths are, and rather than being punitive towards them when maybe they don't succeed or perform in the way that you expect them when you give them kind of a stretch assignment or something outside of their wheelhouse, rather than being punitive towards that, really focusing on, this person is very good in compensation, or this person is very good in benefits, or this person is very good in employee relations. If they're great in employee relations and maybe they're not so good in compensation, we don't want to be punitive around a role that we've or a project we've given them to work on in compensation. So we want to think about you're strong in employee relations. Let's continue your strengths there. Let's develop your strengths there, and let's get you to become a leader in that function. And thinking about the context is critical. So we want to make sure that our employees always understand that the development that we're providing for them is central to the business mission and the culture and the challenges and opportunities that our organizations face. We want to develop the whole person. So focus on what leaders need to be and to do in the future to help maximize those strengths. And we have to think about development not just as a destination, right? So it's not just getting to a certain point in your career or achieving a certification or completing a class. It's a continual journey. So needs change, priorities change, interests of employees change. So development is always going to be a constant kind of travel path, a constant journey rather than a destination. And we're seeing a lot of shift in employee engagement surveys and in kind of culture in general within our organizations to understand that what people do it matters, and what the value that they feel their service provides to the organization matters. So providing a sense of purpose, making sure everyone understands the business's philosophy, the organization's kind of approach, the mission, the values of your organization, and reinforcing those values regularly through conversations between managers and employees, through communications internally, having those mission statements, those values constantly reinforced, and having people maybe be assessed against those values really kind of serve to promote not only organizational culture, but serve to promote the employee's sense of what they're doing matters, what they're doing has a cog in the wheel of the organization. They provide a critical piece of the ongoing support and progress and positivity of your organization, but also understanding where they fit into all that. And we understand that that's increasingly critical. We've talked a lot about the differentiation between thinking about talent development versus, the process. But however, we have to have our processes in place. So before you make any changes to your leadership or your development, your learning, your performance management programs, really we have to think about ensuring that all your ducks are in a row from a process standpoint. So making sure that you have digital options for people to be able to explore learning opportunities. We're seeing kind of a trend towards invisible L&D. So development opportunities will be kind of pushed to employees rather than being and having employees be able to kind of go in and access them as they want to, as the need arises, as their interest allows them and their time allows them to kind of go and explore new opportunities. We're seeing kind of that trend happen. So instead of just a push towards learning opportunities and development opportunities from organizations, really allowing the employees to go search what they want via multiple platforms, via online mobile applications, via their laptops, via their desktops, whatever, having the ability to kind of access it 24/7. Some things to think about if you want to, shift in terms of your organization is to think about the levels that you have in your job architecture. So think about, do you have too many internal levels? Do the levels all make sense versus market? And think about really pushing guidance for the future rather than thinking about just the past. In terms of talent development, we really think that the trend of check-ins will drive these development conversations. So check-ins are not going away. They're only going to increase in popularity, and they're only going to increase in demand from our employees. They're going to want more continuous feedback rather than that one time per year kind of static look-back approach. They're going to want more frequent kind of formalized feedback from managers, whether that be quarterly, twice a year, or more frequently. We want to think about having small team structures so that our talent can learn from one another collaboratively on projects and provide leadership opportunities early in their career. So don't just wait till they're established leaders, but get people up and running and get people opportunities quickly so that they can kind of understand and learn what they don't know, learn how to become a leader, learn how to develop themselves, learn how to learn for themselves. And providing career coaches and mentors, so having a managers really truly be advocates for employees is only going to increase in terms of need and demand, and it's truly a critical and wonderful first-line approach for organizations to have managers be able to serve as those career coaches and mentors. And it doesn't have to be just a manager who provides coaching to employees. It can be peer-to-peer programs. So, if you're a new hire or you're new to a function or you're new to a role or you're new to a geography, having an established peer-to-peer kind of formalized team that can kind of work with employees through their developmental needs is effective as well. So we want to think about coaches and mentors, not just from manager to employee, but from peers to peers. And sometimes we have to think about, new employees may know more about certain topics than maybe more established or tenured employees. So allowing for learning to happen in two ways. So allowing for coaching to happen in two ways and providing those opportunities is also critical. So now I'd like to get into the first of the case studies I'd like to share with you today. And we're going to talk about Yum Brands. And Yum Brands is the parent company of many organizations, one of which is KFC, the franchise fast food restaurant. So they really had a progressive development program that I'd like to share with you all today. They really focused on people development over process development. So the impetus was of kind of really shifting this and being really proactive and progressive around people development was that they had really high attrition, 138% attrition rate across the organization year over year. Low customer satisfaction, and so they developed a program called the People Promise. And so they really talked about, what is this People Promise? How are we going to make sure that we invest in our employees, that we invest in the franchises, and that our employees and franchise owners understand KFC's development and commitment to them to make it a continued great culture and a great organization and kind of turn the ship around to have less attrition and to have more customer satisfaction, and have more engaged employees. So the People Promise had a mantra, and it was, and I'll quote here, be your best self and make a difference and have fun. So that was kind of the mantra they pushed out to employees. And in their program, they had three goals: a knowledge goal, a belief goal, and an action goal. And then they set up metrics for each of those goals and measured employees and managers alike against those metrics. And that kind of resulted in their performance review every quarter. And at the end of each year, compensation decisions were made based on kind of the attainment to these goals. The knowledge goal was that KFC members understood the people promise. They measured this by an engagement survey and also an internal newsletter called Your KFC Voice. They had a belief goal, and that was that team members were engaged overall. So, how do they measure that? They did that by engagement surveys as well. And an action goal, which was to improve overall guest satisfaction. And so they measured that by doing voice of the customer surveys on people's receipts when they would come into the restaurants, or having people actually physically in locations, engaging customers to ask them about their experience there at the organization. But they really focused on the development between managers and employees and the coaching that happened between managers and employees. And that was really the focus here. So they had a people promise that said, KFC invests in you as our people, and we're going to really empower managers to drive home these three goals: this knowledge goal, this belief goal, and this action goal. So what they did was they developed kind of a pocket guide. And I know you probably won't be able to see this too clearly. The text is a little blurry, but you'll be able to see it more clearly, I think, in the downloaded version. But I'll walk through this with you. They basically gave all their managers this pocket guide that was comprised of 9 questions. And every time they had a check-in with their employees, these are the questions they had to kind of assess. They did this on a monthly basis. So the managers were given these pocket guides. They would sit down and say, okay, this month I'm going to talk to John on the 15th or whatever. And they talked about performance, their employees' potential, and they did a check-in of the culture. So the performance questions really were, so the managers were just kind of prompted to say, I want to begin our conversation by letting you know what I appreciate about your performance last month. So it is kind of a look back and saying, this is what you did. Here's what the positive reinforcement. Here are the good things that you did. We're not going to talk about punitive things in this conversation, but I'm going to reinforce the positive choices that you made, the positive performance that you had. And then the second question was, if you could have been more effective in the last month, what would you have done? So it gives the employees the opportunity to think about, maybe some missteps they made or some opportunities that they had, and assess and vocalize and articulate for themselves, where they think that they maybe had a misstep, or where they think that they maybe had an area for opportunity, and what they would do to course correct and fix that in the future. And then, what do you think I could improve? So the managers are asking face-to-face, monthly with their employees, how can I do better as your manager? Then they would flip the topic to really be about potential. So again, thinking about development, thinking about your managers as coaches. What do you like about your current position, and how could it improve? So the managers are touching base with those employees, getting a sense of what they like, how could they improve, what maybe they see for themselves in the future. And then they would say, what motivates you at work? So what is it that you really like about your job, and how can we ensure that you continue to do that? So here's what you do good at, here's what you like, and let's make sure that, this area of focus continues for you, or we increase your responsibility in this area. And where do you see your career in 2 years? So again, this is all about development. So the managers are really thinking these 3 questions, thinking about, how can I assess what you like, what you're doing well, and how can I promote and push you forward in the future? And then they'd close it out with a culture check-in. So again, KFC really wanted to drive home this people promise idea. So that was to reinforce, that KFC was invested in the employees, invested in the culture, and they wanted to make sure that culture was all the way down throughout all levels of the organization, so that everyone talked about what their cultural values are, what their mission statement was, and really made sure that managers reinforced that with employees. The questions there were, what would you do differently? What could a team do differently to make you feel valued and respected? If you could change one thing about our culture, what would it be? And then how would you like to learn to grow over the next month? So checking in with, what do you like about the culture? How can we do better? And then reinforcing that people promise. We are investing in you. How can we develop you over the course of the next month before I talk to you next? What can I do? What can I as a manager do to help you before we speak again next? So really empowering managers, giving them this toolkit, but also making sure that they, actually have the ability to do it and have that frequent check-in and really drive that home as a mission critical point for leadership in KFC. So we know that development is imperative. Business reports, so 61% of business reports say that they don't have enough talented executives. We see 74% of businesses say that there's a shortage of talented mid-level managers. And 58% of companies think college graduates are not adequately prepared for their roles as they enter the workforce. So what we have to do is really listen to these statistics and understand that companies are suffering and that we have to find ways to make sure that our talent meets our needs. So by developing leaders who can really drive change and building a pipeline of ready now leaders. So not developing people once they're already in leadership roles, but getting them ready for those leadership roles so they can be plugged in as needed. Creating a culture that's engaging so that employees and managers, again, understand the value of these conversations and that employees have that empowered kind of engagement so they can search for learning and development opportunities themselves and really drive their own growth in their own careers and their own success. And lead with purpose and sustain superior results is critical too. We want managers and employees both to understand the value of development, the value of learning, the value of really assessing and having strong and effective conversations with employees, and that will lead to lasting employee engagement and only superior and increased results. Some more statistics for you here. 66% of companies say that developing leaders to drive change is a critical priority for them over the next year, and filling gaps in the leadership pipeline. So again, development really is stepping up to the table here. These are critical needs our employees in our organizations have. And the focus is really shifting towards development activities and understanding how to best be effective in that space. Again, we see that companies say that 17% of their organization, only 17% of executives feel confident that their organization has leadership capabilities in their pipeline right now. So thinking about how to address those leaders that you've identified, we can think about them in really three kind of categories. So the first of which is first-level leaders, and these are, leaders who are on the front lines of functional units within your organization. They lead small teams. They play a vital role in implementing change on local levels. And the pace at which change adopts on these kind of smaller first-level teams is really critical, and it goes very fast. And this is instrumental in creating broader cultural change. So the more you empower these first-level leaders, these smaller teams, these localized teams, the more culture kind of can be adopted from the ground up, so to speak, and really be, positive and have positive effects throughout the whole organization and spread as leaders move up throughout the organization, as members of those teams shift roles. And thinking about mid-level leaders, they really these are the people who shape and, determine outcome of the organization. So these are managers of managers. And they're accountable for growing revenue, managing costs. They may experience, if you're really pushing development activities and performance activities through employees here, these are the people who are going to probably give you the most pushback. These are the people who have P&L responsibility, who have accountability for revenue. And so they may say, all these costs associated with development, with learning, I don't see a quick return on this investment. I don't see a near-term or short-term performance reversal here. So these may be the people that you experience the most pushback. So convincing them that development activities, learning activities is an investment for the long haul and to really drive your organizational culture and to really embed leaders there who will stay there and be successful and not have to be replaced or have to have new people come in from out of the organization to be brought up to speed is critical here. And then your high potential leaders are, these are generally kind of the younger or mid-career leaders who've been identified as future leaders. So these are your greatest source of innovation and strategic excellence. So we have to provide them with, development programs that are focused on experiential learning. And experiential learning is key. We see that in employee engagement surveys constantly say, people who are going through processes or programs where they get to do the job, where they get to learn by doing, this is where development, this is where learning really takes place and can really then be translated and put into practice in everyday life in their jobs. We also want to set clear expectations with our employees. So when we have conversations, talk with them about the activities and projects they're working on, what milestones look like. Talk with them about what's next. What does success look like? So as you're engaging employees and managers, figure out what the metrics are that make sense for your organization, for the business unit, and figure out how to best track success against those metrics so that you can demonstrate return on investment after your programs have been enacted for 6 months or a year or 2 years. And you can kind of really address and see where your gaps are and measure returns on filling those gaps. Self-evaluations are also critical, so allowing the employees the chance to kind of really think about, where are their strengths themselves, identify their own strengths, and figure out kind of their own path is critical. Next case study I'd like to share with you is BAE Systems, and they are a British-owned defense contractor. They have a footprint in, aerospace and defense and military, and they really had a focus on shifting their managers to have more power or more innate empowerment within conversations with employees. They were really experiencing a vast leadership gap and a vast developmental gap. So what they developed was called the Early Career Development Program, and they defined this population as really being kind of new emerging leaders. And they started with 12 people internally. When they decided they wanted to really shift towards development, their HR group sat down with 12 business leaders who met once a week for an hour, and they really got and dove into what each of those business leaders needed out of their organizations, out of their talent, and got commitment from them up front and said, we are the internal leaders. We want this. They're going to develop, content ideas and timelines for programs to develop internal leaders. And then those 12 leaders were then kind of the internal advocates for this career development program, which they called a Catalyst program. And their development solution was this 70-20-10 kind of split, which I think many of us have seen elsewhere. But 70% of learning, again, is happening via experiential learning. So it's on the job. It's via a stretch assignment. It's by working in a cross-functional team. It's by working in special projects or having community involvement or job rotations. One thing they did in their Catalyst program was they had the attendees of the course do presentations to the other members of their course or their cohort about what it is their job was, the business unit they sat within. So they had a mixed group of people in the cohort, and they all taught each other about not only what they did, but what their area of the business did. So the people in the cohort basically reported back saying, not only did I learn more about my own organization that I work in by having to dive deep and really do a kind of detailed presentation to my cohort, but I learned so much more about the other aspects of the company. And so this really empowered people to know where else in the organization they might see themselves in the future or might want to move to down the road. The other 20 and 10% of their development solutions were focused on exposure, so having kind of discussions and having mentoring and coaching assessments and education, so traditional kind of instructor-led courses, e-learning and certifications, or attending conferences. And this is the agreement that they developed for managers. So let's say that I am in the cohort. I'm going to go into this Catalyst program, and I'm going to have I'm going to be developed as an internal leader, as someone who is going to be kind of invested in by the organization. Well, my manager has to sign this manager partnership agreement, where as the manager, they have to abide by these principles, these SPARK principles, to support the delegate on their journey, to probe them often and discuss what they're learning, so have constant conversations around what it is they're doing in their coursework, to apply learning and takeaways in the work setting. So when the managers learn about what their employees are doing in these sessions, they're figuring out ways to have them apply it on the job in real life in the short term. Recognize the delegate for their commitment and their progress and knowledge sharing. So as these delegates in this Catalyst program learn, they are expected to share with other people they work with, other peers, and people they interact with on a daily basis. So we'll take a quick moment and have our third polling question, if you don't mind. And we want to know how you describe your internal coaching and mentor program. So do you have nothing, or do you think it is a defining benefit? It's a hallmark of your organization, or you're not sure, or maybe you have you think that you have effective development coaches in place. So we're seeing that most of our organization have no training. So there is no formalized internal coaching or mentor program in your organization. So I think this is a great area for opportunity, a great area that we can make direct impact in the short term by enacting and enabling managers to have coaching and development conversations and to allow them to really function as coaches for their employees. So, in fostering that. So think about it. If you're a manager, you're going to talk with your employees not just once a year, but we should kind of foster them the idea that they are coaches. If you are a coach of a team, when you're in the middle of a game, you're not going to wait till the end of the game to talk with your players and course correct as you as the game progresses. You're going to have constant regular feedback and constant regular sessions where you sit down with them and coach them on what to do next or how to respond to challenges. Okay, thank you. Go to the next slide. And so most of the attendees of our audience today said they had no formal training. And so in a recent survey, we see that 27% of companies said they also had no training, but 45% of companies said this is a defining benefit of their organization, a hallmark of their performance management process, that managers are acting like coaches, or there's some formal mentor program happening internally, whether it be peer-to-peer or strictly via managers. So really, that's a defining benefit we see that companies are really focusing on, and we know that learning and development activities are going to be front of mind in the course of the next coming year. So really making sure that we think about how best to enact these programs in our organizations is critical. We can do this by having these regular check-ins. We can do this by having our managers understand and recognize obstacles as they arise and know how to address them and shift and course correct as necessary. We can do this by having managers equipped and trained about how to evaluate strengths of their employees and opportunities to enact or enable those strengths to only grow and develop further. We can do this by having our managers act like coach and by looking ahead. So again, not having strictly a punitive approach, but thinking about what's next down the line for our organizations. I'll go through a next case study really quickly. It's a bank in Turkey called Isbank, and they are a large international bank with a large European footprint. And they had a problem with branch managers being kind of up to speed as they got on board to be branch managers. There were a lot of issues in terms of training and development that weren't being met by new branch managers, and people were not kind of, attaining the level of customer satisfaction, attaining the level of, new loans or new business that they had as quotas by each quarter. So they really thought about how are we going to enable our branch managers to be better. So they came up with a development program for candidates who want to become branch managers. So if you wanted to become a branch manager, then you went through a one-year continuous program that was blended learning. So you went on kind of your own personal development journey where you figured out where your skills were, what needed to be reinforced, and you had your own learning activities that you could use to address those. And also they had a program where you would go to each branch manager candidate would kind of cycle through and go to different branches within different regions where the bank had their footprint. And with certain managers who were strong in certain areas, they would sit with them for 2 weeks and go through kind of the lessons learned from that manager, shadow them, and really understand what they were doing that made them so successful in certain areas. So it was a blended learning program over the course of 1 year. Again, they had really thought about where the gaps were. So they had workshops with those current branch managers, one-to-one interviews with stakeholders in the business units where they kind of were able to identify candidates and understand where their needs were. And then the development areas identified right away that, our new managers of our branches are not aware of credit risks, are not focusing on customers like we want them to. They don't have the right managerial skills that we want. So really thinking about where are the areas that we see the critical need and making a program to alleviate those needs. I'm going to skip over to the final case study that I'm going to share with you today, and that's T-Mobile. So T-Mobile back in 2012 had a failed merger with AT&T. So they had to really kind of rethink their business strategy. And one thing they did to kind of gain a lot of popularity and market share was they branded themselves as the Un-carrier. So they did away with 2-year contracts that most of cell phone providers mandate. They allowed customers to carry data over from month to month. So, if you don't use it, you don't lose it. So that data kind of carried over. And they did other things that allowed their customer base to really grow. For example, they allowed for people on low incomes to have payment on demand. So they weren't tied to a contract every month, and weren't tied to a set amount of a month that they had to pay. They could kind of pay as necessary and as needed as the need arose for them to have the phone. This resulted in a market share growth of 22 million new customers from 2013 to 2015. That's the largest growth in the mobile phone sector at any time of all sectors combined in a 2-year period. So huge growth. And so they found that they really needed to make sure that their people were equipped to handle this growth. So they identified strong leaders. They identified ways to develop leaders and how to make sure that leaders were able to, meet the need of the growing company. Not only those leaders who were out face-to-face in the front line in local stores dealing with customers, but also internally in the corporate functions, in HR and finance, in IT. So I identified kind of, who are our development opportunities, who are our high potentials, who are we going to really focus on, and they had various workshops. What you see on the screen now is an example of kind of the first half of one day of a workshop. So it's the morning half, and they would get there and they would have, introductions, and they would connect people to business goals. They would really share what the business goals are, have audio clips reinforcing those goals from leaders. And about 80% of their day was spent in applying what they've learned or applying new ideas, applying ways to enact the company's values and mission statement into real-life scenarios, whether that be role-playing or strategic games within a collaborative environment in terms of working together with a team in this session, but really kind of making sure that the most part of the day was about applying what they were learning, putting what they learned into practice, whether that be through individual reflection time or working in pairs, again, working in table groups or groups-led, groups by level to identify kind of commonalities and kind of their similar work experiences or similar challenges so they can share with one another. One thing that they gave managers is basically a laminated placard or place setting that managers could refer to at any time. So every manager kind of got, these are development topics we want you to think about with your employees. And they called the program AMP, which was to accelerate my performance. So employees who were in this program were really going through kind of a fast, quick-paced development program. And INVEST was the experience that employees would have based in what kind of rewards and recognition they would have. So as I accelerate my performance, as I, kind of go through this AMP program, how is T-Mobile investing in me? What am I, seeing as a result of my hard work and my, attainment of milestones? But in terms of what you see on the screen now, managers were given these place cards to have on their desk and how to really kind of reference periodically as they needed to, and develop the development topics they wanted to really managers to think about and drive them towards were, think about what stretch assignments your employees can do. Can you put them as a project lead on some kind of project or work or role or task force? How can this employee's role expand? So can they take on any extra responsibilities you can identify? What do they do well at? How do you want them to grow? What about a rotation? So if an employee moves to another role at the same level, can they learn more? Are they interested in that? What does that look like? What can we do to help facilitate their interest in other areas? And formal skill development, of course. So understanding where the skills gaps are for your employees, driving those employees towards formal skills development opportunities that exist for them, whether that be this program, this AMP program, this Accelerate My Performance program, or other learning initiatives that may be in-house, whether that be e-learning or seminars or workshops or monthly lunch and learns, or the ability to, foster an employee to go and get a certification somewhere externally. So let's take a pause real quick. I know we're kind of coming up short on time, but I want to know, I think those programs that T-Mobile just shared with us, or we talked through, that they were really driving their managers towards doing, are really great and really great resources that I think we can all enact with very little time and effort and very little expense. So I don't have any formal statistics around what companies are doing, but I thought those were really great ideas. So I wanted to see kind of from our audience members who are doing these types of ideas. So who already offers stretch assignments or allowing team members to become project leads on task force or new projects as they arise, or foster role expansion or rotations and offer formal skill developments. And it seems like our audience is doing a little bit of all of that, less on the rotation side. So that may be something to think about. So, offer these types of opportunities to employees, figure out how that works. And maybe it doesn't work great for every organization, or maybe it doesn't work great for every functional skill within your organization, moving from one to another. But identify where those kinds of cross-calibrations can exist, where employees can move to other roles and be successful and not be a hindrance, but also learn and contribute. So that's something to think about for all of us. And we'll move on to the next slide. And finally, before we close out, I just want to kind of think about, again, compensation. So as we talk about performance, as we talk about development, we have to think about other aspects of human capital management, all intrinsically related. And compensation, of course, is a part of that. Rewarding performance via compensation is a tool that we all use. And we really should think about the narrative of pay for performance and what that means. And are we reinforcing that? And are we driving that home with our employees? So differentiating or decoupling compensation and performance discussions is a trend people are adopting, and one that I think makes a lot of sense, because you want to make sure that in those conversations with your employees, you're talking about their development, and you're not distracted by thinking about the employee's not going to be distracted by thinking about, okay, what does this translate into my take-home pay? What does this translate into my variable pay? So you can really think about strictly the employee's performance. And when you do make pay decisions, we should be guiding our managers to make employee performance a critical piece of that against kind of what their own individual goals were. So did they attain their goals? Did they reach those goals as they may have shifted over the course of the year? What does that look like? Evaluate the employee's performance in comparison to their peer groups. You also have to think about your organizational budget. Maybe some year you're not going to have as much to spend on performance and recognition than you will in other years. So, this is obviously a hindrance. This is obviously a constraint that we work within. And using market data both internally to understand kind of internal equity issues and external market data through our standard third-party survey providers. Using all of these pieces of the puzzle to kind of think about compensation decisions. And finally, we want to think about, again, best practices. If you change and shift your performance management processes, if you change and shift how you approach development and how you enable managers to really be strong mentors and coaches, we want to make sure that we collaborate with and engage our internal business partners. We understand the voice of the customer. We understand what's working. Maybe we don't need to change everything. Maybe we need to keep some tools or facets of what we're already doing, and what doesn't work. So we understand where the gaps are, where we need to address critical issues for change. We want to enable collaborative learning environments. So we're seeing time and time again via employee engagement surveys that employees work better and learn better when they're doing it together, and when they are actually enabling or putting into application, putting into practice something that they've learned. That's when real true retention and development truly occurs. And we have to incorporate metrics into all of our developmental programs. So as you change and shift anything in your program, first of all, you should be measuring what you're doing now, and then you can measure any shift that may occur from changes that you make, so you can really demonstrate and make a strong case for the investment that your organization is putting into not only its people, but the programs that you're developing. Communication is critical, and having strong internal development coaching programs where employees and managers not only work together, but are driving one another to understand how they can best retain those people, develop those people, and make sure that their success continues for the organization as a whole. And with that, I'll stop. I know we're right up against the time, and I'll just pause and see if Holly has anything for us to sign off with, or any questions at all.
Yeah, we have wrapped up our presentation for today, and thank you for all the great information, Jeremy. We went the full hour, and if we've got the information to fill that hour up and we can educate our listeners, then all the better. So thank you also to Cornerstone OnDemand for making the webcast possible. And to all of our HCI members, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to spend with us. Remember to take a look at upcoming HCI events by clicking the Attend a Conference link at the top of this page. We look forward to seeing all of you participate in another HCI learning opportunity soon, and have a great day.